Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, firstly, I would like to thank the President of the General Assembly, Ms. Ambassador Dennis Francis, for arranging to convene this meeting of the General Assembly on this day, 15 March, which was declared 2 years ago as the International Day to Combat Islamophobia by the General Assembly in Resolution 76/254, sponsored by the Organization of the Islamic Cooperation and other like-minded member states. Mr. President, I've asked for the floor today to introduce a follow-up draft resolution in document A/78/L48 on behalf of the OIC and other co-sponsors on measures to combat Islamophobia. Mr. President, Islamophobia is as old as Islam itself. It was generated by atavistic fears and prejudice. It was manifested by the racist colonization and brutalization of much of the Islamic world in the past few centuries. In the current era, Islamophobia resurged after the terrorist attacks of 9/11. Despite the adoption of the General Assembly's resolution on Islamophobia 2 years ago, despite the declarations and statements made against Islamophobia by the UN Secretary General, by the High Commissioner on Human Rights, by several of the special rapporteurs and mandate holders of the Human Rights Council, and by other leaders promoting interreligious and intercommunal harmony, the incidence of Islamophobia, of discrimination, prejudice, and violence against Muslims, and all that they hold sacred, have risen exponentially both at the societal and state levels. At the societal level, Islamophobic incidents happen across the world almost on a daily basis. These are manifested by the despicable acts of desecration of the Holy Quran, with 7 such incidents recorded last year alone. The lynching of Muslims by cow vigilantes. Islamophobia is also manifested by the widespread hate speech against Muslims, online and offline, in discrimination in education and employment, in attacks on women wearing the hijab, in the vandalization and destruction of mosques and other holy sites, including the Holy Al-Aqsa Mosque in Jerusalem, in racial and religious profiling, in the media, which spews hate and prejudice and fuels fear against Muslims, in the calls for genocide against Muslims and Muslim minorities, which go unpunished. And yet, Mr. President, most governments refuse to adopt laws and rules that would prevent and punish such acts of Islamophobia and incitement to violence, often on the spurious ground of the defense of the right to freedom of expression. Yet, this freedom ends if the Holocaust is denied. This freedom ends if you are demonstrating for Palestinian rights or protesting against Israel's plausible genocide in Gaza. What is worse is that Islamophobia is not only tolerated but propagated by a growing number of states and political leaders in the democracies of this world. The rise of right-wing and fascist parties and politicians in recent elections confirms and consolidates this Islamophobic trend. There is, I fear, an emerging coalition of the killing. Mr. President, a Prime Minister gleefully consecrates a Hindu temple on the ruins of a historic 500-year-old mosque. His party is bent on eradicating the country's rich Islamic legacy. A citizenship law is implemented that would deny asylum to Muslims alone and is designed to render 200 million Muslims either stateless or second-class citizens. In another geography, a Home Secretary of the oldest democracy castigates the police for being, and I quote, too lenient, unquote, against pro-Palestinian demonstrators opposing Israel's brutal Gaza campaign. Immigration policies are designed to deliberately exclude Muslims. Travel bans are imposed against Muslims. Hijab bans are officially imposed. The Muslim call to prayer is prohibited in some states. And ridiculous rules have been promulgated to prevent so-called love jihad in the largest democracy. Islamic names of cities are being replaced. The Islamic legacy is being obliterated. Mr. President, the most egregious current manifestation of Islamophobia and racism is Israel's military onslaught in Gaza. The killing of over 30,000 Palestinians, mostly women and children, in Gaza, and calls for genocide against the Palestinians have been justified by describing them as, I quote, human animals, unquote. The same mindset has led to the foreign occupation and suppression of Muslims elsewhere and to the series of foreign interventions in Muslim countries. Mr. President, clearly, for those who adhere to the principles of interreligious and intercultural harmony, it is entirely evident that bold and decisive actions are needed to counter and combat Islamophobia. This is the purpose of the draft resolution submitted in document A/78/L48. The original version of the OIC's draft resolution was circulated over a month ago. The sponsors conducted 3 rounds of open, informal consultations. In good faith, we accommodated a number of concerns expressed by the European Union and other interlocutors. Changes were made, both in the preambular and operative parts of the draft resolution. In operative paragraph 4, we faced the inexplicable opposition to the reference to the Holy Quran. So we changed the language to mention the Holy Book. In the same paragraph, we also dropped the words condemnation, I quote, in the strongest possible terms of the Islamophobic incidents. And we deleted the phrase which originally stated that such acts were in violation of international law. And yet, Mr. President, after accepting all the concessions made by the OIC sponsors, these mostly European delegations have submitted the amendments contained in documents A/78/L51 and A/78/L52. These last-minute amendments are inconsistent with the constructive approach of the co-sponsors throughout the negotiations on the draft resolution. If we had known that our interlocutors were bent on preventing a consensus, we would not have accepted the significant concessions we have made. For example, by removing the call for the formulation of a plan of action to combat Islamophobia. We would have stuck to our original text. In any case, Mr. President, we strongly oppose both the amendments. The proposal in document A/78/L51 to remove the reference to the Holy Book is unacceptable. The desecration of the Holy Quran offends the sentiments of all Muslims and other peoples of faith. We do not agree that deliberate acts of burning and desecration of our holy book can be justified by the so-called right of freedom of expression. The OIC has consistently called for the criminalization of such acts. And in fact, this was agreed in Resolution 1618 of the Human Rights Council 13 years ago, but it has not been implemented. We welcome Denmark's agreement to do so. We urge all other countries, especially the sponsors of these amendments, to follow this example. We urge all members of this Assembly who revere and respect all holy books and sacred texts to oppose this amendment. Similarly, Mr. President, we oppose the amendment in document A/78/L52 to replace our call for the appointment by the Secretary General of a special envoy by a, quote, focal point. Let me explain why. A focal point implies a role of coordination. This may be sufficient and appropriate where numerous actions are being taken in various places against a particular problem, such as anti-Semitism. But in the case of Islamophobia, no specific and concrete actions are being taken by most governments or even by international organizations such as the United Nations, despite the statements of the Secretary General, or by national agencies. The exception is the welcome appointment of a special envoy on Islamophobia by the United States administration. Can the United Nations do less? Why should not the United Nations also have a special envoy so that we can take action against the rampant rise of Islamophobia? Mr. President, our purpose in seeking the appointment of a UN Special Envoy is to initiate specific actions to combat Islamophobia. We hope the Secretary General will deliver on his several statements that he is willing to propagate such actions. We also hope that the UN Special Envoy will take the lead in formulating such actions to be taken by the United Nations and all its member states to combat Islamophobia. Mr. President, we believe that the text in draft resolution L48 is balanced and deserves the widest possible support of the member states of the United Nations. We urge all fair-minded delegations to stand firm against prejudice and reject the amendments contained in documents L51 and L52 and vote in favor of the draft resolution. We thank those who have already co-sponsored the draft resolution in L48, and we count on their full support and that of other delegations for this important resolution. The sponsors are confident that on this, the International Day, the world's peoples will unite in combating Islamophobia and other ideologies of hate, domination, and division. Let us firmly oppose those who seek to promote Islamophobia, particularly on the International Day to combat Islamophobia, by obstructing consensus on this critical issue in the UN General Assembly. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Pakistan. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Belgium to introduce draft amendments A/78/L51 and A/78/L52.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for giving me the floor. I have the honor to speak on behalf of the European Union and its member states to introduce two amendments on the present resolutions, documents A/78/L51 and A/78/L52. Let me first stress that anti-Muslim hatred and discrimination is unacceptable and violates the principles and purposes of the UN as enshrined in its charter and the provisions of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. The EU and its member states strongly condemn anti-Muslim hatred and discrimination, as we condemn all forms of discrimination, hostility, or violence against persons on the basis of their religion or belief. We are wholeheartedly dedicated to this cause and remain committed to work together with the OIC and the rest of the international community. Combating anti-Muslim hatred and discrimination can best be undertaken by promoting and protecting everyone's right to freedom of religion or belief. As the main sponsor of the annual resolutions on freedom of religion or belief in New York and Geneva, the EU advocates for a comprehensive and universal approach which seeks to eliminate all forms of incitement to discrimination, hostility, violence, and intolerance directed against persons based on their religion or belief, including non-believers. We firmly believe that the freedom of expression includes the right to free speech on religious matters. For us, it is essential to maintain the internationally agreed definition of hate speech as contained in Article 20 of the ICCPR. Any advocacy of national, racial, or religious hatred that constitutes incitement to discrimination, hostility, or violence shall be prohibited by law. Freedom of religion or belief is, like all other human rights, an individual right, which can be exercised in community with others. It does not protect a religion or belief as such or its symbols, nor does it prohibit the criticism of religions or beliefs. Chair, we appreciate that the facilitator Pakistan, on behalf of the OIC, organized informal consultations in which the EU engaged constructively. The EU made several proposals aimed at improving the text, and we are disappointed to see that our main concerns were not taken on board. Regrettably, the text in front of us falls short of fully meeting the requirements of international human rights law and diverges from the inclusive approach to combat intolerance, hate, discrimination, and violence appropriate in the context of the United Nations. Firstly, the EU has strong reservations against the wording of operative paragraph 2. In our view, the UN should be religious neutral and not refer to desecration of holy books. Under the Vienna Declaration and Programme of Action, for instance, the term desecration is limited to the religious sites only. International human rights law does not protect a religion or belief as such, or its symbols, nor does it prohibit the criticism of religions or beliefs. Secondly, the EU has reservations against the creation of a special envoy, as proposed in operative paragraph 3. We are concerned with the duplication of several mechanisms in place to address discrimination based on religion or belief and the financial implications. We strongly believe that a focal point would be more appropriate, making use of existing structures and resources, such as the current focal point against anti-Semitism, High Representative Moratinos of the Alliance of Civilization, whose valuable role is also recognized in the preambular section of this resolution. For these reasons, the EU decided to propose amendments to operative paragraph 2 and 3 in line with our and other delegations' proposals all along the informal consultation process. In the new OP2, as contained in A/78/L51, our amendment brings the wording in line with international human rights law. In the new OP3, as contained in A/78/L52, our proposal is to establish a focal point within existing structures and resources instead of a costly special envoy. We call on all delegations to vote yes on these amendments. I thank you, Mr. Chair.